Saitama throwing an insane punch, Hinata jumping up for a speedy backslide hit. All these scenes have one thing in common. They all made an impact. You know what made these scenes so effective? The masterful use of perspective. In particular, it's a perspective drawing technique called foreshortening. I'm sure you probably heard that word before. It's one of the most difficult techniques that beginner mangakas have to overcome. If you're currently struggling to learn how to get foreshortening right, then make sure to stick around until the very end. Because in this video, we'll be covering all the foreshortening basics that you need to know to finally level up your dynamic scenes and poses in your manga. If you're ready to finally share your manga to the world, then we invite you to join our online one-shot manga drawing program. We're finally opening our doors again for consultation calls. We're going to give you an exact roadmap on how to create your own manga with the guidance of pro-Japanese mangakas. They'll give you feedback live during our weekly Zoom sessions. Plus, you'll be in a supportive community learning with fellow aspiring mangakas who are just as awesome and passionate as you are. We will only be taking on 20 aspiring mangakas this term. Think you've got what it takes? The link to book a call is in the description. P.S. You have to be at least 18 years old to qualify for our program. In the meantime, make sure to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and turn on notifications for more free manga tips and tutorials. Before we dive into foreshortening, let's first understand the concept of perspective. Perspective drawing is a technique that gives the illusion of depth to your drawings. For example, we know what a house looks like and what it's supposed to look like. But when we try to draw it on paper, it's a different thing altogether. I mean, a lot of beginners draw houses that look like this, or this, or this.
I can't draw buildings.
Yeah, it looks like a house, but it doesn't look like a real house, you know? This looks more like a real house. It takes a bit more practice to make your art look realistic. You have to learn how to draw 3D objects in 3D spaces. And you gotta start by learning about perspective. You need to have these two basic elements. First is your horizon line. Second is at least one vanishing point. The horizon line is a horizontal line that represents your viewer's eye level. If you look at pictures of any scenery, the horizon line is the line where the sky seems to meet the ground. The vanishing point is a point on the horizon line where everything in your drawing seems to vanish into the distance. Buildings, objects, and characters will look smaller the closer they are to the vanishing point. When learning how to properly draw in perspective, you'll have to draw and follow guidelines. These are parallel lines that meet at the vanishing point. Use these lines as a guide to draw how tall or short your buildings or characters need to be. You need to do this if you want to draw all the elements out consistently and realistically. Now, for most drawings, the horizon line is typically located in the middle of the page. This is your standard eye-level view. But this could be positioned anywhere depending on the angle of your scene. The problem with most beginners is that they're stuck drawing scenes and characters in the same standard eye-level view. Let's compare these two versions of the same page. They're both One Punch Man. This one is from One Sensei's original webcomic, and this one is the redrawn manga version by Yusuke Murata. Do you notice the difference? One Sensei drew more simple art with the shots looking pretty much the same for each panel, whereas Murata Sensei used more dynamic shots and added backgrounds. The second panel, for example, is way different from the original. The perspective is from an overhead angle. You can see Saitama's messy apartment. They're not in a cafe or a restaurant, they're in a small private area. The setting is clear. In the last four panels, both versions used bust shots. But in Murata Sensei's redraw, the backgrounds and characters are drawn in perspective. You can see how the characters exist in a 3D space. Like, how far apart are they from each other? How do they interact with the furniture in the apartment? Perspective makes your scenes look more realistic. Now that we have an idea of perspective, let's move forward with foreshortening. Foreshortening is basically an application of perspective. Let's start by checking out this photo. This person is standing straight, perfectly still, and facing front. Now, look at this second photo and compare. The second image is an overhead view of a person crouched on her knee, reaching her hand towards the camera. Can you spot the difference between these two images? In the first image, all of the person's body parts look proportional. Both her hands and feet are the same size, both her arms and legs are the same length, and her head seems to be the normal, correct size for her body. That's because she's standing still and her entire body is in full frontal view of the camera. The camera is at eye level. But in the second image, the camera is at a higher overhead level. The person's right hand seems to be larger than her head and her left hand. It honestly looks like her hand is big enough to cover her entire body. But why? That's because this image is in a different perspective and the person is moving. Her pose is dynamic, with different parts of her body moving either closer or farther away from the camera. You see, objects that are closer to the camera appear bigger, while objects farther away appear smaller. This is how foreshortening creates an illusion of depth and perspective in your drawings. It's a visual trick that artists use to mimic 3D space with 2D drawings. Now, let's look at some examples in manga. First, look at this panel of Luffy. Luffy's thigh covers his torso and crotch area. That's because his leg and thigh are in direct view of the camera and blocking some of his body parts. How about this panel of Yona? Her upper left arm is extremely shortened and her forearm is mostly visible. That's because she's looking directly into the camera and extending her arm towards it. Now, look at this panel of Yuya. His fingers and knuckles curve over his palm. His forearm is shortened because it's close to the camera, blocking the end of his upper left arm. Have you noticed that at certain angles and perspectives, parts of the character's body appear shortened or are not visible at all? Whereas some body parts look bigger and block the others from view. That's foreshortening. When you think about it in terms of perspective, parts that are farther away are closer to the vanishing point. That's why they look smaller or seem to shrink or shorten. If you look at objects or people from any angle, you'll see that parts overlap. This is an important thing to remember when learning foreshortening. Parts will overlap, depending on what direction the object is facing and how close these sections are to the camera. Let's take an arm, for example. Think about how an arm looks from different angles. The camera is at eye level. If that entire arm is in full view of a camera, as in stretching to the side, it'll be at its normal length, or its longest. If the arm seems to be halfway pointing at the camera or going nearer towards the camera, it should be half its normal length. And if the arm is directly facing the camera, it'll be at its shortest, or not visible at all because of the knuckles blocking the view. Now, if drawing an arm seems a bit too complicated for you, that's okay. As a total beginner, we actually recommend that you do not skip straight ahead to drawing body parts and actual characters. So, what do you start with? Our pro mangaka mentor, Naoyazawa, says that if you want to learn how to draw in perspective, you gotta start by learning how to draw basic shapes or forms in perspective first. And you gotta start by mastering how to draw boxes in different angles. It might sound really basic, maybe even a bit boring. But according to Yazawa sensei, understanding the concept of a box is really important if you want to draw in 3D. So let's take her pro advice to heart and let's start off by understanding the 3 most common angles in character drawing: front view, 3/4 view, and side view. Now, try drawing a box from the front view, 3/4 view, and side view. Make sure to visualize and draw all sides of the box, even parts that aren't visible from each angle. Being detailed like this will help you understand how all parts of an object will look in different angles. This is an important skill you'll need if you want to master foreshortening. Use a vertical center line to represent the front face of the box. As you draw each angle, notice how the center line's placement changes as the front of the box moves away from our view. Does it seem easy enough? What you've drawn so far are boxes at eye level. Now, let's switch things up and move on to another exercise. We're gonna turn up the difficulty one level higher. Are you ready? Let's try drawing boxes in bird's eye view and worm's eye view. In the bird's eye view, the viewer is looking down with the horizon level placed slightly higher in the frame. In the worm's eye view, the viewer is looking up with the horizon level placed near the bottom of the frame. In this activity, I want you to draw boxes stacked on top of each other. As you do that, pay attention to the length and warp of each box as you go higher. We recommend using a ruler to make sure your lines are consistent and accurate. What's even better is to use guidelines. If you're using a digital program, there may even be settings where the program can automatically generate these guidelines for you. Use them to your advantage. Don't just eyeball it. A lot of beginners think that having these guides make them less of an artist. They think it's cheating. Unfortunately, skipping these steps and not making time to properly understand these concepts are the very reasons why they can't draw in perspective in the first place. As a beginner, you have to embrace the basics. Draw using guidelines, draw boxes in different angles. Once you've mastered boxes, you can try the same exercise with other basic forms like cylinders and pyramids. It might be hard to believe now, but once you get the hang of all of this, drawing your characters in perspective becomes way easier. In fact, here's another simple technique you can use to practice drawing characters in perspective. Draw a bounding box. Think of this box as a container for your character. It'll help you visualize them in 3D forms. This will also help you correctly position your characters in different scenes. You can try what our students do. Analyze manga panels with characters in an interesting perspective. Draw a 3D bounding box around each character so you can get a sense of how they're placed in these scenes. This is great practice when learning perspective drawing and foreshortening. Now, the question is, how can you tell what's bad foreshortening and good foreshortening? Well, when you're drawing, you need to have a good sense of depth and scale. You need to have good observational skills of how things would actually look like in real life. Again, your rule of thumb should always be the closer it is, the bigger it is. The farther it is, the smaller it becomes. For example, look at this drawing and think about everything you've learned so far. This is a drawing of a person reaching out to something off camera. Do you see anything wrong with it? We'll give you some time to think. The drawing seems about right at first glance. The perspective is correct, but the proportions are actually off. That's because the left hand is closer to the camera, so it should be bigger. Look at this second drawing and compare. The drawing on the left has bad proportions, so it comes off looking a bit flat. The drawing on the right has correct proportions, so it looks more realistic and dynamic. This drawing is an example of good foreshortening. If you want to get a better sense of scale and perspective, you can use this exercise our students do. Look at reference photos and practice breaking them down into simpler shapes. The best way to get better at perspective drawing and foreshortening is to draw from reference. That way, you can study how real bodies move and look from different angles. We encourage you to do this over and over again. And remember, copy with intention. As Yazawa Sensei always says,
don't just copy the lines, understand the entire structure as you draw.
Perspective, foreshortening, all these concepts can be difficult and overwhelming. But it's all worth it when you can finally put your ideas accurately on paper. Plus, you don't have to struggle through this alone. If you want a step-by-step guide on how to draw, write, structure, and create your own manga, then we invite you to join our online one-shot manga drawing program. You'll be working with pro-Japanese mangakas through weekly live Zoom sessions. You can ask them questions, they'll provide feedback on your output. You're also going to be surrounded by an amazing community of fellow aspiring mangakas who are in this journey with you together. We're only taking on 20 new students to start this October. Think you have what it takes? You can book a consultation call with us to see if you're a good fit to join our program. The link is in the description. P.S. You need to be at least 18 years old to qualify for our program. In the meantime, you can check out this other video where we talk more about perspective and how to draw backgrounds for your manga.